Hello folks, it is almost the end of June and I wanted to do a little garden tour, and I thought that this was great lighting. It's just before 8 p.m. and here in the Northeast it's amazing, there's still sun. You can still see the sunshine, um, and the garden is really starting to go. Most things that are going to be planted have been planted, and I'm seeing a absolute explosion of growth that started about 2 weeks ago. And so I'm going to do a quick overview of the garden, and then I'm going to drill down into specific elements. And if you look over here, you'll actually see a raised bed. And this is a pretty big raised bed planter box. And in it are a bunch of volunteer sunflowers and a large variety of herbs, and I guess I would say more experimental crops, such as this Miyoga ginger right here, and then sea kale, and several different types of pak choi and len ray choi. There's even some Malabar spinach in there. Horseradish that's just absolutely taking over the entire planter box. I don't even know what I'm gonna do with this. I've already begun trimming some of the leaves to get some light in. And here's volunteer pumpkins. And we have tomatoes over there. And tried to do some more pak choi over here. Some yellow tags to track the flea beetle pressure. And these are new planter boxes over here that were inspired by this large planter box that's behind me here. And here's our main garden space. These are, I'll call them 100-foot rows. They're technically 96 lineal feet. And they were originally based upon the fairly standard market garden format of 30-inch rows and 8 or 10-inch walkways. And we've kind of shrunk them to 26-inch rows and 14-inch walkways. It kind of happened organically over time, but I actually prefer now to have more space in the middle. And the first thing you're going to immediately notice is that it's pretty weedy in here, and weeds are ever so controversial in that I've really changed my relationship with what a weed is in the past couple years in particular. And here's my brassica row, and you'll see we have a mixture of the previous year's brassicas. This is winter boar kale, my favorite, and we're letting this go to seed. And then in between some of these plants left to go to seed is the new cropping. It's doing quite well, and you'll see here it's pretty weedy. Here's a radish from last year that's going to seed here. We've got plantain, through several kinds of plantain. We have sorrel, we have lots and lots of clover, 2 or 3 different varieties of clover, and a light dusting of wood chips in the walkways. There's, I believe, 4 different tomato varieties this year. There was more last year, but we're trying to narrow them down to the ones that we really like. And we're experimenting for the first time with cattle panel that we reclaimed from a derelict hedgerow of one of our wonderful neighbors. And I'm really already enjoying the system. You just twice a week turn them and weave them through. And this is likely to turn out to be half the effort of the trellising we were doing last year. And going back to the quote unquote weeds, I'm starting to radically change my opinion on a lot of things that seem to be common sense. And one of them is that, with the exception of tremendous external pressure from plants that I don't intend on eating, like for example, here we have some of the Lucinato kales, and I believe they went in a little bit later. And you can see here we have 30 different plants here all kind of competing. I'm not even worried about this. This does not even particularly bother me right now. And there's so many different kinds of native flowers that just are constantly popping up in here. And I can't even keep up with the different varieties. But what I do know is that I'm primarily only worried about photosynthetic layering. And what I mean by that is if the plants that I'm trying to grow, my primary criteria now for if I'm going to come in here and remove these plantains and some of these grasses are they beginning to aggressively steal the sun from the plants that I'm intending on eating? If the answer is no, I leave it. Almost entirely leave it. And there's few exceptions. One of them would be if I actually need to get in there and I need to see, or I want to encourage good airflow inside the row, depending upon what it is. Like, for example, tomatoes, I would probably not allow it to be quite so dense. But for brassicas, don't give a damn. And you can see here's last year's, I believe I think this is Red Russian. And here is this year's Red Russian. And sometimes I'll plant the same thing in the same area twice, and other times I won't. It just depends. And here's an experiment for this year, strawberry boxes. These went in really late, and it's amazing that they're already starting to do quite well. And there's already been, a couple dozen strawberries eaten out of the patch. But what I like about this is these are actually mobile, and the strawberries are just much easier to police, not trying to grow out in the open rows. And it'll also make them easier to manage. And I'm hoping to have a huge amount of strawberries in the next couple years. And you'll see a bunch more seed kale. Here's something you don't usually see in upstate New York. Here's my big 5,000 square foot sprinkler, and we've actually had to use it a couple times, amazingly, to just broadcast water over the whole garden. And if you believe it, we are down many, many inches for the year right now as it stands. We had a period of time where, I'm probably being slightly hyperbolic, but I believe we had less than 1 total inch of rain in nearly 8 weeks. And for this climate, that is absolutely, and that is a bonkers. That's bonkers. It's incredibly low amount of water. We should have probably received 6 to 10 times that. Here we go again. Here is winter boar, my personal favorite. It's doing so well. And here's something that I have learned, actually. Now, understand here, this is where am I at? This is a 3rd-year-old row. And it has been in brassica family for two of those 3 years, and then it was tomatoes, one of those years. And this is incredibly poor soil. When I say incredibly poor soil, the pH is typically below 5. It is just heavy clay and what they call fragipan, which is basically almost the equivalent of wet drywall or sheetrock for people that are familiar with construction. Imagine a clay layer on the ground that is so compressed that it behaves more like a soft stone than it does like a clay or earth. And so what we have here in this particular zone 5A soil climate right here where this garden's located is incredibly acidic, very, very, very low organic material, incredibly low organic material, and very high mineral, very high mineral and elemental content, very, very poor NPK and organic material. And so it's taken a while to get where we are. And one of the strategies to doing this is to willingly allow all of the riffraff plants, the plantains and the grasses and even the goldenrod, et cetera, to do some work for us. And so, every individual plant is going to be bioaccumulating from below ground to above ground, a slightly different chemical composition, or elemental composition. And so I really have changed my relationship. I view every single plant you see growing anywhere as a literal elemental and mineralogical nutrient pump that's pumping out of that deeper fragipan and clay soil that is incredibly tough to work. It's pumping those resources back up to the surface. And I'm also trying to be mindful of trying to grow a good soil food web. And so hopefully with minimal soil disturbance, this is definitely not no-till. However, I don't really personally find a huge utility in any kind of deep tillage. And we've mostly been doing what people call tilthing, or we like to call it scruffling. And so you can see that's actually what happened here before we planted these kales. And so came through and scruffled this, ripped up the top, ripped up the top, 1 to 2 inches, pretty aggressively, just to suppress the native plants, and that will buy these brassicas time. And if you did it right, what will wind up happening is you'll have a huge crop of brassicas like this, and only a handful of other plants filling in the gap. You see we have plastic. This is the first time in my entire life there's ever actually been some row plastic used in the garden. One of our wonderful neighbors actually had quite a bit of it left and gave us, I think, a 500-foot roll of it. And we've had a terrible time the last couple years with peppers, and also we've struggled with tomatoes. And so we experimented with using the row plastic to warm the ground up and attempt to plant our peppers and our tomatoes early. And so far, the experiment is actually going incredibly well. Now, understand though that part of my, garden slash, just garden philosophy is that this is ultimately, what we're looking at here is a trade-off. And this is clean. This is good for the tomatoes. It's going to dramatically reduce the amount of parasites and fungus that would otherwise live in the moist understory of the tomatoes. However, what we're doing here is we are, how can I say this quickly? This photosynthetically and, mineral and nutrient bioaccumulation pump rich, this is poor. And what I mean by that is that every one of these plants growing in here is doing some unique characteristic that will ultimately improve this landscape for growing food. This plastic smothers all of that wild growth. And so basically what you have here, that I believe we have to understand, is we are trading all this bioaccumulation and soil and tilth creation for tomatoes. And this is a trade-off that we wanted to see what would happen. And it looks like it's going to go really well, and we're going to get a crap ton of tomatoes. And so this is a trade-off though. You can't do this in this incredibly depleted soil for too long before you start running into a tremendous amount of deficiencies, of which this soil is very deficient. And so I was actually skeptical we were going to get any kind of results out of even trying this plastic, because I want tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of calories of photosynthetic energy occurring at the surface of the garden as much as possible. And it's a short-term versus long-term trade-off. And so what we're going to have to do here to make up for this is likely very aggressively, after these tomatoes have peaked, when it's still far early enough in the season, for us to get another kind of cover crop in here, we're going to have to remove all of this infrastructure and then plant a aggressive amount of cover crops in here, and then let them go. And those cover crops will hopefully begin to catch up with what you see happening here. And so you've got your seasonal or your harvest based goals, you've got your annual goals, and then you have your multi-annual goals. And so I'm very happy to see what's happening with the plastic, and it's allowing me to have a greater appreciation for what plastic can do for minimizing labor. Not that there is much when you don't mind the native plants as much. However, it's a trade-off. And I mean, you can just look. Here's a good example. There's only 2 rows of plastic, and the rows are only 26 inches wide, and no plastic and no plastic. And if you notice, it's basically a green carpet. And here we have the wood chips, which are not really contributing much because they're over the plastic. And then the plastic with the only, photosynthesis happening on the plants that we're actually growing. And so I don't have a more concise way of describing it other than this is a trade-off, and we're going to see how this experiment goes. And keep going. Here's a tremendous amount of red Russian kale seeds. I don't even know what I was thinking. I should have only let one plant go. I'm going to have pounds of brassica seeds. And over here, we ran out of tomatoes. And so we have actually interspersed squash and cucumber, which we're hoping will grow up the fence as well. It may or may not. We didn't actually have enough viable brassica seeds to fill out the entire row. And so we've actually interplanted a crop that I'm probably going to do a whole video on soon. This is called callaloo. I believe that's a Caribbean name used in Jamaica. I believe it's just a fairly common type of green amaranth. However, I've come to appreciate this as being quite possibly my favorite green now. And it is vigorous, and it will grow into a giant plant. And I actually think that these leaves taste, if sauteed, I think they actually taste better than any other green that I may have ever had. It's definitely tied with incredibly good brassicas or incredibly good spinach. And here's the thing about this. I'm definitely going to do a separate video on just this one plant. However, it is incredibly vigorous. And so, for example, and it'll put on leaves the size of, I can't think of describing it. The leaves will get up to 1 foot long and 9 inches wide. It's massive leaves. And if you look at, this is a small plant. This plant's only been out here for a month. And if you see all the nodes, and it looks almost like an indeterminate tomato. Can you see that? See these individual nodes? It will fractal like this in all directions, and this plant will grow to 6 feet tall. So imagine a greens-bearing plant that grows like an indeterminate tomato, grows as fast as an indeterminate tomato, and also gets 6 feet tall. And as you can tell here, there's not that much pest damage on it. There's very little pest damage on these, and I don't fully understand why. I believe it could be because it is just an alien plant to this microclimate in this zone. And what I mean by alien plant is that this particular variety I purchased because it was supposedly adapted to the Caribbean, which I'm not even exactly sure what that means, but it grows vigorous, and there's very few predators here that like to munch on it, and very few. I mean, yes, it happens, but it's not like what you would expect. And so these have only been in the ground for a month. These have only been in the ground for a week, and 3 weeks from now, these will be as big or bigger than these, now that we are at perfect growing temperatures all the time. And so, yeah, callaloo, or I believe a type of common green amaranth. And I'm going to explain in my video why I like this so much. And I'm starting to actually develop an appreciation for growing much more fragile, much warmer growing zone plants as annuals in zone 5A, because I'm beginning to have an appreciation for how vigorous some of these subtropical plants, literally subtropical plants, actually are once they're in the right environment, and how few predators and how few pests predate upon them inside this zone. And it's kind of amazing. And we have some unused space. It's breaking my heart, but I'm not exactly sure what we're going to put here. We have, here we have, I believe, chickpeas, pinto beans, black beans, and one or two other weird variety of pole beans. And chickpeas, this is funny. This is an experiment from one of my friends. And these chickpeas, first off, they're a really cool looking plant. And I'm not sure if you've ever seen them up close, but they're just getting started here. These were actually only planted a couple weeks ago, I believe. And these were planted about a month ago, roughly. And these were actually from a store-bought bag of chickpeas. A store-bought bag. Think about that for a second. They were still viable. Germination was probably less than 50%, but who cares? I think it was like about $3 a pound. It's just an experiment. It's just an experiment. And so far, it looks like they're doing pretty well. They're not doing quite as good as these beans here. And you can see here our experimental bean trellis. And these were actually hoops we originally made for the tomatoes the previous years. And I think they're going to do really well for beans. And so what happens is we're going to add another rope. We're going to add another twine every 8 to 12 inches up as they bush out and they continue trying to climb. And I think this is going to be a pretty good system, and I think that's going to give them all the climbing that they need. Here is another kind of experimental row, and this is a weird intercropping of daikon radish, 2 different varieties of peas, the occasional cucumber, and a handful of interesting tropical plants. This here is a wing bean, and you have to look that up. It's the craziest plant. It grows a long beanstalk. Imagine like an extra large green bean, but it has these wings that come off of it, and the wings are an inch long. It's kind of like getting a bean in a salad at the same time. And you can see the daikon is doing really, really well. And the peas are just, they've been taking their sweet time. And yeah, that's the row. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens. It's not particularly productive. It could have been done much better, but we're just going to have to make do. These are huge chive pillars. These things are so beautiful when they put out all of the bright purple flowers, and it brings in all the pollinators to the yard. And here's our subsistence potatoes, and they're doing okay. This is going to be one of our better potato crops. However, they're on average only planted between 2 and 4 inches deep, the seed potatoes were. And so it's going to be, it's probably going to impact the harvest a little bit. I've considered coming through and adding some mulch if I have it, or wood chips, just directly, just lightly dress it over this, just to add a couple inches of bulk to the ground, to try to maybe perhaps encourage a little bit more growth. But yeah, I'm not really sure if I'm going to do it or not. And this row right here, you can't tell, but it's a failed carrot experiment. And I used some very old carrot seed, and the germination was terrible and slow. And so it's now just turning into a wild row that the moment I come up with a good strategy will probably clear and do something else. And here's a new carrot cropping. And this one's going to struggle too, but these are actually doing better, and they're getting ahead of the weeds a little bit. You can see right here, they're actually doing pretty good. Carrots are tough. I really like them. I like to grow them, even though I never do it well, and I don't mind. Now, if you look at this, this is a pretty unruly row. Look at this. This is just, this is like 8 inches deep now. It's mostly just different grasses with a handful of carrots in there. And what I will probably do with this is my soil building technique that has kind of been adapted from what I've seen many different other market gardeners do. And what will probably happen is I'll actually mow this with a push mower set as low as it goes, so that its blades are damn near touching on the ground. And I'm just going to mow it and just mulch this whole thing into just a big green pile right on top of the surface of this raised bed, this row. You can kind of see the contour. And it's funny because everything's context dependent, right? And this is usually a very wet climate in the spring and early summer during the primary planting season. Incredibly wet. So wet, actually, that if you don't do water mitigating strategies, it could actually cause a lot of your transplants and a lot of your seeds to rot and get disease and fungus. And yet this year was the exact polar opposite. And so this is one of the reasons also why, even though I consider myself pretty agnostic anymore to all the native plants wanting to grow inside the garden, I've actually allowed them to grow even more than normal, because we need to keep the moisture in the ground. And so you can see, it's the walkway is probably an average of 4 to 6 inches recessed to the row, and then the row. This particular row has, 8 to 10 inches of growth on it. I'll mow this down just all the way, the deck as low as it goes, just like a half inch off the ground, and mow it. And it'll leave this green pulp right on the surface. And then I have two choices. Let that green pulp kind of dry and begin decomposing, and let all the worms come up and start grabbing it and start pulling it down into the soil over time while I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to plant in here. Or mow it and then immediately come in and tilth the top inch or two of this. And I have a strong preference for mowing it and then immediately same day or next day tilthing it in. And then you wind up with this, it's hard to describe quickly, but you wind up with this incredibly rich, light, warm, layer of topsoil that's basically just a ground up mix of the top inch of soil and all of this organic material. And I find that seems, in my opinion, to improve germination. It also seems to really, really kill almost every plant root system that's in the row, which buys whatever I plant time to get established before the native plants invade the space again. And it's easy to seed into with a seeder. It's easy to plant into by hand. And I also think that it causes a small burst of microbiological, mostly bacterial activity inside the top inch or two of soil. And so that's been what I've been doing. And it seems to me to be having a fairly large effect on building the overall quality of the soil. And yeah, so there's the rows. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 7 96-foot rows. We can just say 700 feet, lineal feet of space. And it's not, it's actually not that bad. It's not that much work. I don't know. We don't work this anywhere near as hard as we could. But that's also by design, kind of, the whole lazy gardener thing. And so this whole space really only requires, you know, 3 to 6 hours a week during, you know, the planting and preparation season of hard work. And then now almost nothing, almost nothing. I mean, I could weed for, you know, I could weed around some of the plants I don't want to have overgrown for an hour every once in a great while. But other than that, I'm already beginning to spend the majority of time out here picking food to eat. So yeah, I love it. This is the new addition to the family. This is 4 large planter boxes. And like I said before, everything is context dependent. And these are a little bit of an investment, a capital investment, but it's not actually as expensive as most of you would think, because there happens to be an Amish sawmill only about a 20-minute drive away. And it's much more affordable than most people would realize to order 2x4s and 2x10s or 1.5x12s, which is what these sidewalls are. The sidewalls are a very simple box design. It's 36, the box is 36 inches inside to inside. I can actually do a whole video on just these boxes and just quickly explain how they went together. Because it's really simple, but I can give you the super brief synopsis. These are they're 24 foot long each. There's 2 1.5 by 12 foot boards, and they're mended in the middle with a 2x4, dimensional 2x4. And you can see right here, there is some threaded rod that goes through the box, and you know, daylight's on the other side, and they're squeezed together to exactly 36 inches. Otherwise, with a foot of material in them, they would begin to bow horribly. And the threaded rod is the only way you can hold that pressure, because you can't just put a board in the middle underground and put a couple screws in it, and it'll just rip the screws right out like nothing. And so these boxes are created explicitly for the purpose of getting some soil up off of the wet ground in spring, the cold, wet ground in the spring, and allowing it to warm up a little faster, and also just not be, you know, a near swamp-like condition until June 1st. And so we don't have a truly good plan for what's going to happen in these planter boxes yet, but we've got sweet potatoes in them now. Sweet potatoes are just starting to get going. We have some volunteer storage potatoes from last year where we had a potato bed here. In fact, every one of these boxes has volunteer potatoes in it, and some of them are doing really well. And I find it pretty interesting. And I just realized how long this video is getting, so I'm actually going to stop it here, and I'm going to do a part 2. And in part 2, I'm going to talk a little bit about the garlic, or the asparagus, and also most importantly to one of my whole operations is my pond system that I have right next to the garden. And